What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our quarterback rankings for Week 14 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, number one overall, I've got Jalen Hurts going up against the Giants this week. Your quarterback 2 so far on the year in fantasy football, coming off of his best fantasy performance of the entire season. 34.4 fantasy points on average in week 13 against the Titans, 380 passing yards, 3 touchdowns through the air, and a rushing touchdown as well. Jalen Hurts just looked absolutely on fire last week. I just think he holds the most upside out of any quarterback this week in an important game against a divisional opponent in the Giants, who they face again in week 18. Don't forget, the Cowboys still have an opportunity to take this division, so the Eagles have no reason to take their foot off of the pedal. I think that Jalen Hurts, coming off a monster week, is going to have another very productive week against the Giants here in week 14. Moving right along, I've got Josh Allen. He comes in as your quarterback 3 so far on the season, going up against the Jets this week. I just feel like Allen is due for a big performance. Didn't necessarily need to do too much against the Patriots last week, but I think that he is due for a good game here against the Jets. Once again, this is a close division. The Jets are the next best team in this division behind the Bills, and they are fighting to keep their playoff seeding as high as it can get, and the Bills are doing the same. So I think that's going to be a competitive game. I think that Mike White is going to lead this Jets team to some good offensive drives, and that ultimately Josh Allen will have to keep things competitive. I think he's in line for a good day. Just 16.9 fantasy points in week 13, 223 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 20 yards on the ground. But like I said, just didn't need to do a lot in this game. The Bills were ahead for a majority of this football game. I think he's going to have a much better week here in week 14. Moving right along, I've got Patrick Mahomes, who is your quarterback number 1 so far on the season, as my 3rd overall quarterback. Just a little bit of a cap ceiling in my mind against the Denver Broncos, one of the better defensive units in the entire league, and more specifically from a fantasy perspective, pretty damn good against the quarterback position. But let's face it, Patrick Mahomes, an absolute baller. He's going to get you 19 plus fantasy points on average on a weekly basis. So I'm not worried about Mahomes at all. I just think his ceiling is a little bit capped, and I see a better game script for Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen on the week. Mahomes finished with 19.8 fantasy points, a tough day against the Cincinnati Bengals in week 13 for Mahomes. 223 passing yards and a touchdown, but still got you 19.8 fantasy points. Like I said, his floor is extremely safe. I just don't think his ceiling is extremely high this week. But with that being said, I will not be surprised if Mahomes is the number 1 quarterback on the week. He is that good. All right, the Miami Dolphins have been awful against the quarterback position all season long. I think that Justin Herbert is going to have a nice week. I've got him as my quarterback 4. He comes in as the quarterback 8 so far on the season. In his last 3 performances, 18 or more fantasy points. He's definitely been playing a lot better in the past couple of weeks as compared to the previous weeks where he was kind of in a little bit of a slump. I think he's going to have a good game. I think it's going to be a game with a lot of offense. I think it's going to be a competitive game. Like I said, 18.1 fantasy points in week 13 for Herbert against the Raiders, 335 passing yards and a touchdown. I honestly expected a little bit more out of him in this performance, but ultimately still a good day. I think he's going to have a really good day. If you own Herbert, I think he's a very solid start against the Dolphins here in week 14. 5th overall, I've got Joe Burrow, who I have a lot of confidence in this week against the Cleveland Browns. It's worth noting his worst fantasy performance of the year was against Cleveland Browns in week 8 in Cleveland, but I think he's going to have a much better game at home here in week 14. I think that the Bengals really are going to want to beat the Browns this week. Ultimately, Burrow is the quarterback 4 so far on the season. 30 fantasy points in week 13, 286 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 46 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown as well. Joe Burrow's playing phenomenal football. Like I said, your QB4 so far in the year, he's going to have another very productive week, a very safe floor, a great ceiling for Burrow as we approach week 14. All right, next up on the list, I've got Tua time going up against the Chargers. Like I said when we discussed Justin Herbert, I think this is going to be a game with a lot of offense. Both of these teams doing everything they can on the offensive side of the ball to win. This football game should be a fun little shootout. Tua had just 15.8 fantasy points in week 13 against the Niners, 295 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, but also the 2 interceptions. I mean, what you can bank on is that this Miami Dolphins offense is going to be explosive on a weekly basis and be extremely competitive. The Dolphins just got in a situation last week where they were playing from behind. Tua made a couple of mistakes, was not his best fantasy performance. And the week before that against the Texans, they were just absolutely balling, right? Tua just did not need to do anything in that game. The defense and the run game were taking care of everything. So I do feel like Tua is in line for a little bit of a higher ceiling as we approach the week. I like him as our quarterback 6 as we move into week 14. Next up, I've got Geno Smith as my quarterback 7. He comes in as your quarterback 7 so far on the season. 23.9 fantasy points in week 13 against the Rams. 367 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. But I think that Geno's going to put together another solid stat line. I know it's not the most intriguing matchup against the Panthers, who have been pretty good against opposing quarterbacks actually on the season. On top of that, it might not feel like the most competitive matchup, but I actually think that the Panthers are going to kind of fight through this football game. And really, the Seahawks have no reason to kind of take their foot off of the pedal right now. They need to win as many football games as possible to establish the best potential playoff seeding for themselves and to potentially win this division as well. Don't forget, they are not the only team in contention for a division title. So I think that the Seahawks are going to do whatever they can this week in terms of their offense. I think Geno Smith is going to put together another good stat line. Since week 8, he has had 19 or more fantasy points in every single one of his matchups. I expect big things out of Geno as we approach week 14. All right, next up, I've got Kyler Murray, who I've seen kind of further back on a lot of lists, but Murray comes in as your quarterback 10 so far on the season. He's missed 2 games and he had a bye week last week. I think all things considered, Kyler's had a really good season. Yes, this offense has struggled throughout the year, but if you take away week 3 and week 6 of the season, he's had 17 or more fantasy points in every single start that he's had. So it's a little bit of a tough matchup. I get that. I think the ceiling is potentially capped for Kyler Murray this week, but I think ultimately he puts together a good stat line. I think he's a good start against the New England Patriots in a game script where I would assume that the Cardinals are going to need to throw the football quite a bit. So obviously Kyler on bye week last week, not a lot to go off of, but I think ultimately on the season, Kyler deserves a little bit more respect in the rankings as we approach the week. Next up, I've got Captain E like that, Kirk Cousins, who comes in as your quarterback 13 so far on the season, but he gets to the Detroit Lions. It's a great matchup. Should be a good little divisional shootout between Jared Goff and Kirk Cousins. I think both these teams are kind of hurting defensively right now in terms of their secondaries. I think that Cousins has a nice day. Just 11.8 fantasy points in week 13 against the Jets, but was really just kind of managing that game, letting the run game and the defense kind of take care of things while the Jets kind of try to creep back into that game. But 173 passing yards, a touchdown, just 11.8 fantasy points. So not a great day for Cousins, but I think he'll have a much better week here in week 14 against the Lions. 10 overall, I've got Trevor Lawrence. The Tennessee Titans are the second worst team in all of fantasy football against the quarterback position. Trevor Lawrence is your quarterback 9 so far on the season. He's expected to play in week 14, but it is worth noting he has been dealing with a foot injury since last week. Got a little bit banged up against the Lions. So I like Trevor Lawrence if he's good to go, if he's fully healthy. He's got a big ceiling going into the week. The opportunity is really good for him against a Tennessee Titans team that just got absolutely torched by the Philadelphia Eagles. All right, quarterback 11 overall, I've got Derek Carr going up against the Rams on Thursday Night Football. I kind of tend to stray away from Thursday night matchups for the quarterback position. I just always feel like they're kind of lackluster. But ultimately, when we look since week 9, Derek Carr has had 17 or more fantasy points in all of his matchups. He's actually been playing a lot better as of late. He's your quarterback 14 so far on the season. 250 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception in week 13 against the Chargers. I think Carr brings a really safe floor as we approach the week, but I don't expect a high ceiling, especially against a bad Rams offensive unit. I feel like the Raiders will end up running the football quite a bit in this game. Quarterback 12 overall, I've got Dak Prescott. Listen, Prescott's playing good football. The Cowboys are playing phenomenal. In his last 2 games, he's thrown for 5 touchdowns, but he's also thrown 3 interceptions. But that's not really why I've got Prescott a little bit further back. Ultimately, the Houston Texans are probably the worst team in all of football right now, and they are easily the worst team in the league against opposing running backs. Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard are going to take away all the volume in this game. The Cowboys are going to be running all over the Texans, and this defense is going to be making a ton of plays. I just don't think the Cowboys are going to need to throw the football that much. I don't think Prescott's going to need to be really involved in this game. 17.8 fantasy points in week 13, 16.8 in week 12. I just think when we look at this Cowboys team right now, they are running the football. They're playing great defense. Prescott is playing good football. Don't get me wrong, but ultimately, I just don't see a huge ceiling for Prescott as we approach week 14 in a matchup where, let's face it, he's just not going to be needed at the end of the day. All right, quarterback 13 overall, I've got Jared Goff, probably my top streaming option on the week. He's your quarterback 17 so far on the season, 17 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games, 21.6 in week 13, 340 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, no turnovers in his last 2 games. Looked really good overall in weeks 12 and week 13 after having those really bad performances kind of between week 7 and week 11 outside of his week 8 performance against Miami. We're at 18.6 fantasy points, but it's a good matchup against the Minnesota Vikings this week. I think that Goff is in line. When we talked about Cousins, we talked about this game being a shootout between the two. I think both these teams are going to throw the football a lot. I think the run game will be involved. But I think that Goff is going to have a nice day, an important divisional game against the Vikings. I like the game script involved here, so I think Goff is a great streaming option as we approach the week. All right, Ryan Tannehill is dealing with an ankle injury, but he is expected to play against the Jacksonville Jaguars. A good start, a good overall streaming option if you need one in Tannehill, just a really safe ceiling and floor involved for Tannehill. I could definitely see Derrick Henry being a large part of this offensive game plan, but ultimately a good matchup and in a divisional game where, the Tennessee Titans need to come out and establish themselves as a dominant team within the AFC South. So I think that Tannehill is in line for a good stat line as we approach the week, but ultimately just a streaming option in my eyes. All right, Mike White finishes things out as my quarterback 15 on the week. 19.4 or more fantasy points in Mike White's 2 starts so far on the season. 19.4 fantasy points last week against Minnesota, 24.8 in week 12 against the Bears, and week 13, 369 passing yards, no passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions, but he did make up for it with a touchdown on the ground and ultimately with the passing yards as well. He gets the Buffalo Bills this week. They're a little bit banged up defensively, but over the last week or so, they've started to kind of come back together. So he's a little bit further back on the list, but I still think that Mike White is a solid streaming option and still deserves to be within the top 15 as we approach week 14. Here are the best of the rest of quarterbacks who did not make my top 15. You've got Deshaun Watson, who I really advise you guys to not start last week. I want to talk about him because I don't think he's necessarily a great start this week, but when you look at the quarterbacks in the same tier, he didn't make the top 15. He could end up being just as good as any of the other quarterbacks here. To be fair, last week I just thought the Browns were going to run the football a lot against the Texans. I didn't think Watson was going to need to be super involved, so I thought he had a really low ceiling, but ultimately, while the Browns did run the football a good amount, they really tried to get Watson involved instead of kind of easing him in. He struggled last week, 131 passing yards, an interception, 21 yards on the ground, and the Bengals are good against the quarterback position. I don't love Watson this week, but I'll keep him in mind. We'll kind of just sit back if you own Watson. I wouldn't start him, but let's just kind of see if we can get a consistent pattern to emerge. A little bit of a tough schedule, but kind of just overall an iffy schedule, right? Baltimore, New Orleans, and Washington after this Week 14 matchup. There's some opportunities here. There's some defenses that kind of bend at times, don't play the best against the quarterback and receiver position, but also have had some really good defensive performances on the year. So Watson's a big question mark for me. I know he's made like a lot of top 10, a lot of top 15 lists out there. I don't have him there. For me, Watson is just a player we are watching right now until a consistent pattern emerges. Tyler Huntley has a nice opportunity against the Pittsburgh Steelers, a team that is not very good against the receiver position at all, one of the worst secondaries in the league, and not very good against the quarterback position, but I'm still a little bit iffy about him. I mean, literally, the Steelers are one of the worst teams from a fantasy perspective against the quarterback position, but, while Huntley had one or two good performances last year while Lamar Jackson missed time. Ultimately, he had a lot of bad fantasy performances as well. So I'm a little bit hesitant around Huntley, but if you're absolutely desperate, he is a streaming option. Tom Brady nearly made the top 15 over Mike White. He's a quarterback 18 so far on the season. In his last 3 starts, 17 or more fantasy points. So the floor is pretty safe for Brady. You know, he hasn't turned the football over a ton this season, just 3 interceptions. One of them did come in week 13 against the Saints, where he also had 2 touchdowns and 281 passing yards. We know that Brady's going to throw the football a ton, but it's just such a tough matchup against the Niners that Brady did not make the top 15 for me, but he still feels pretty safe in terms of a floor. But just due to the tough matchup, I can't trust Tom Brady this weekend. Daniel Jones draws a tough matchup against the Eagles, or else he would have made the top 15 as well. He's a quarterback 11 so far on the season, 17.1 fantasy points in week 13, 200 passing yards, 8 touchdowns, 71 yards on the ground. I still think Danny Dimes, similar to Tom Brady, is a player we can consider starting this week if you have to, but just keep in mind he gets the Eagles a little bit of a tough matchup as we approach the week. All right, last 2 quarterbacks I want to talk about are Mac Jones, Sam Darnold. So let's start with Mac Jones, who's not played well from a fantasy perspective at all this year, but the Arizona Cardinals are one of the worst teams in the league against opposing quarterbacks from a fantasy perspective. He did have 23.2 fantasy points in week 12. And ultimately, I don't think it's Mac Jones. I don't think everything is on Mac Jones here. The play calling for the Patriots has been awful. This offense is just in a huge rut. They have got to change things. Matt Patricia should not be calling plays for this offense at all. There's a lot of problems within the coaching staff here, and ultimately, if you're absolutely desperate, especially in double quarterback leagues, especially in super flex leagues, I think Mac Jones is a deep sleeper against the Cardinals, but that's about it. Sam Darnold, once again, I think a deep sleeper for super flex double quarterback leagues. I would not start him in single quarterback leagues, but depending on your scoring format, he had around 18 fantasy points in week 12 against the Denver Broncos, which is pretty good, right? 164 passing yards and a touchdown as well as a rushing touchdown. He gets the Seattle Seahawks this week. It's a little bit of a tough matchup, but still a team that allows for pretty good offensive days between both teams that are playing, between themselves and their opponent. So I still think Sam Darnold has some opportunities this weekend, but once again, purely a streaming option in double quarterback and super flex leagues as we approach week 14. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.